So good morning to everybody. I'm Sharon Constancon. I'm Chief Executive of Genius Boards. On my panel, I have with me Daniel Summerfield, who is the Business Development Director and co-head of Pomerantz, recently opened London office, a US firm, oldest law firm in the world dedicated to representing the rights of defrauded investors. Previously, Daniel was with the head of corporate affairs with a university superannuation scheme, as we know it, USS, UK's largest pension fund. Prior to that, Daniel co-headed the responsible investment team at USS and was responsible there for his stewardship. So one of the areas that we'll be covering in this discussion. The other panelist is John. I've known both these gentlemen for a good number of years, a decade plus in each case. John has a history in the company secretarial space, but has also been in Chief Governance and Sustainability Officer, and has been in Menzies from retail to aviation. So quite a few years he's been with the organization. John has a keen and comprehensive understanding of the wider logistics market and has experience in acquisitions, startups, listed companies, operational risk, contracting risk, and is the mentor to chairman, directors, executives, coaching them in terms of facing the city, and is the voice of the organization in many occasions from a investor-facing role. So his role has probably mutated as much as the number of chairman and board director changes in his 20-odd years that he's been in the organization. But before we start with the conversation with my two panelists, I'm going to first begin with a very short, quick run through a few slides, just to put us all into the position of the impact and the role of a chair and chairman within an organization. And I'm just going to quickly go through the impact of leadership and how one person can change a board's effectiveness. People do create ineffective boards. People are often the problem that results in an ineffective board. We might have really good structure, we might have really good governance, and we might even have governance maturity, but yet the people can circumvent all the structure and all the governance we may wish and end up collectively with their best intention individually, but collectively actually can fall short of any form of competent governance, competent effectiveness as a leadership vehicle of the organization. So if you look at the different characters we might engage with, somebody who is receptive, listening, inquiring intelligently, wanting to be part of the team, leading it, or somebody who is far more aggressive, dictatorial, authoritarian. Just as an example, we know within our hearts that if we end up in the circumstance of having to deal with these two kinds of characters facing us, how we would change and respond differently to that kind of behavior around us. So we need to be mindful of who we are and how we behave, because it does cause other people to respond in different ways. Now we have people that are chairmen as leaders, where they engage their team, bring the team along them with the journey, and ensure that collectively it works very successfully. We also have those that are the lone bull, as I would call it, operates as a team of one, somebody who makes all the decisions, stands aloof from the team, tells the team what's going on, rather than getting the team to be part of the conversation. So one of the models that Genius has put together over the recent years is that of the leadership quotients that were done by Andrew Kakabadze, and built upon those to get those 5 leadership quotients to the 11 quotients that make up a competent whole board, but individuals have all got elements of all these 11 quotients. Now we talk about diversity, we need diversity. We get IQ and EQ, for example. But what we're looking for is people who've got a risk appetite, people who can deal with technology, people who've got a good moral compass, people who can manage the political circumstances within organizations, So all the different attributes that we have as people to ensure that our board can be effective. I think the pandemic has really given everyone an opportunity to determine their resilience, but equally the resilience that they have within the team and how they work collectively under pressure. So if we look at the 515 board effectiveness model, this is looking at the governance part, the structure, demographics, the people part, the attributes, how we behave as people together, then the different roles and how people perform within the roles that are the leadership roles, and how that delivers boardroom dynamics, culture, cohesion, and challenge. So the area we're going to be talking about today is more around the chair and the committee chairs, company secretary and chief exec, that leadership area that brings together a very key component towards boardroom dynamics. Another correlation that I like to make is that between a board and an orchestra. The chair is our conductor. No musical instrument in their hand, maybe a baton, standing separately, but pulling together everybody in the team, making sure that they can bring of their best at the time needed. Your lead violinist is your CEO. Now you can imagine in an ineffective board, the conductor leaving the podium and going and sitting in the lead violinist's chair and taking the instrument, saying this is how it's done. In the middle of a concert, I don't think that would go down extremely well to any stakeholder group, including the audience. So it's a good correlation for a chair to understand where their role is and ends and where the CEO takes over from them. We always talk about strategy, the goals of the organization, what we're trying to achieve. That's the music. That's the music that the orchestra are going to play. Everybody's aligned to that common canvas, common outcome of producing a symphony. We look at the different sections, the different musical instruments that exist within an orchestra that the chair will pull in from time to time. So this equals our SID, our INEDs, our NEDs, and the COSAC. So that makes up our component elements within our board, which the chair has to lead, ensure that they are pulling together and getting the best out of each section at the time that is needed and appropriate. The instruments that those sections are working with, those actual instruments themselves, you can correlate those to the skills, experience, and capability of the relevant directors, how well they are able to play those instruments, as well as to how they then work within the team. Now, any musician within an orchestra who doesn't play to the team will actually cause a huge degree of discomfort and noise in amongst the efforts of the goal of producing the symphony that they're working on. The orchestra director, manager, music director, you can correlate that to the company secretary, somebody who makes sure that we're all there in the right place at the right time in every respect. So if you look at that, if we actually get this working well, the orchestra produces a symphony, not a cacophony, and a board would become a highly effective board rather than one that can so easily be dysfunctional. I do like my animals, and I do like relating to the animal kingdom because people do remember it and find it easier to correlate the stories. And if you look at the effectiveness drivers and looking at 8 key effectiveness drivers, which is the whole board working together, led by a competent chairman. We've got strategic planning, composition, succession, committee structure, the whole governance of the papers. They're looking at the executive versus operational engagement, ensuring the board stays strategic in behavior, leadership, empowering the leaders in their relevant roles within the board, ensuring that the stakeholders influence and gain knowledge and interaction optimally and fairly. And that gives us our boardroom dynamic impact. We always have one big problem, and I think that's something we might come up in the conversation that we're going to have shortly, is what happens if the chairman's the problem. Now, we do have many elephants in many boardrooms. I always talk about how big and how hidden is the elephant. There's an elephant somewhere invariably, things that a board could do better or address or take on board or learn from. So what we're going to learn today is how that one person hopefully is not the elephant in the room, and that we can as boards talk to the individuals that we are in a safe place, led by a competent chair who will allow people to speak up, step up, and to be able to work together as a team to create the degree of effectiveness that is required. So lovely to have everyone here. And Dan, thank you for coming up on screen. I do appreciate it. A couple of things we'll just go through to try and tease out the experience you have in this field so that we can share with our audience some of the complexities of our day job in the governance space and in trying to make the most and the best out of our leaders. You've worked with many chairs. You've worked with many characters. Some of them have mutated through the chair of the same organization. And you have been in a situation where you will have chairs that have got different focus areas of importance to them. So if you had to sort of categorize the different groups of chairs that you've worked with, how would you put them into boxes and say, what are the sort of typical groupings of chairmen that you have encountered?
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for inviting me onto this panel today. As you say, I've encountered many companies from very many jurisdictions over the years, and it's very difficult to put them into different categories, I would say, because everyone is quite unique in that regard, and that's actually quite good because having that variety and diversity on different boards is quite helpful. But I think if we are going to try and look for a difference, it's those that are really willing to interact effectively with shareholders and explain what really drives that person, what really what's underneath the bonnet of that company, over and beyond what we see in annual reports. And for us as investors, it's extremely important, I think, and this is something I think we're going to go on to speak about shortly, Sharon, this whole concept of stewardship and interaction with boards, to have that insight from an individual who's running the board, who knows, so much about the company and what's driving that company, the values of that company, the strategy of that company, and how it all fits together. That for us is invaluable. And those chairs who are willing to open up and explain how it works in practice, they are the most, for us, they were really helpful and insightful. There were others who weren't as willing to explain and to interact, and we'll just go through the procedures and processes as a checkboxing exercise in the same way as I'm sure some of the chairs on this call will say some of the investors do. But it wasn't that sort of interaction. But you could really see where the chairs were passionate about the businesses that they oversaw, passionate about the boards. And it's that, again, that sort of interaction where you could see where the chairs were confident about the messaging they were conveying, and those who were perhaps rather concerned about the direction of travel.
In your experience, we talk about the imposter syndrome, people feeling they've got to the top of the pyramid and all of a sudden everywhere looks like it's a long way down. To what extent do you think board chairmen have been confident in their role and in their position, or is there a degree of fear of being found out I'm not the best?
It's a good question, Sharon, because I think, going back to my earlier point, the chairs who were confident in their abilities were the ones who sometimes weren't the ones who were willing to give that sort of information. They are the ones who kind of doing it more in a political way, as perhaps a politician might do. It was actually those chairs, perhaps sometimes with smaller companies, mid-sized companies, who are more willing to go outside the box of usual shareholder interaction, perhaps at the concern of the investor relations person who often accompanied them. But as long as they weren't giving us inside information, that was again really, really useful, because it's not as if we were going to divest from the company because a chair was giving us a very candid account of what was going on, is actually more willing to stick with a company that was willing to admit that they had some challenges on the horizon which were being addressed. I think, again, they were the most valuable conversations we had with chairs. So ironically, it was those chairs who weren't suffering from imposter syndrome, who were very confident, where sometimes we weren't getting the information that we were seeking.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting mix that you've come up with there, a bit different to what I might have expected. So yes, and I think your confidence aspect is, I know what I'm doing, stay out of my space.
Exactly. Yeah. Who are you pesky shareholders? Yeah.
What right have you got to come and ask me such questions?
Indeed.
Through the period that you were in that role, we've gone as a society, not fully correlated by our codes yet, because we've moved quite fast in the last 5 years since the last corporate governance code, towards what I call the modern agenda, the issues of the environment that we are in, the issues of the social, the diversity, the community that we need to work with. And obviously governance has always been there. So that is not a new one. It's just sort of added on as though it's a poor cousin to the other two, which is completely inappropriate. But that's another whole story that we'll talk about. Have you noticed in those last years that you were working with the chairs that the boards have become different towards the environment issues and the community and social issues? Or are they still saying, that's going to be somebody else's problem, not on my watch? Where are you finding that really ownership of it?
Yeah, so I mean, I left the responsible investment world as about 5 years ago, but I've kept involved on the policy front. And what I would say is that, chairs are much more willing, much more confident to talk about these issues, such as environmental issues and social issues. And I don't think they've had much of a choice, because this is obviously top of the agenda for many investors. We can talk shortly, I'm sure, about the positives and negatives of that agenda shift. But I think that many of the chairs that we came across were very confident and very willing and able to talk about the environmental challenges their companies were facing and how they were being addressed. Sometimes they had to take in the expert in a particular area just to give the more technical account of what's going on. But I think at a conceptual level, at kind of basic level, it was always going to be on the agenda of board shareholder interactions, which perhaps 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, there was nowhere to be seen. This was something that was discussed between the responsible investment team and the manager of CSR within the company, or company secretary. It is very firmly, as I'm sure the participants on this call will attest to, very firmly on the board's agenda.
Mm-hmm. And it is good to see that these things have changed. And one of the accelerators, probably one of the few positive accelerators that came out of the pandemic, is that we've started to address this modern agenda more face on, particularly in the space of our internal stakeholder, the staff who work for us, the way we treat them in an equitable manner. And many organizations have had a shift in that space as well. As investors, what is your interest in that space, and what sort of change did you see from I know you weren't directly involved in it, but from your experience?
Yeah, so I guess when I was talking before about lifting up that bonnet, lifting up the hood and seeing what's going on, when we've had those conversations with boards in the past, I would say it was often a superficial conversation. We're looking at board dynamics, board at second level C-suite, if you like, what's going on there. But very seldom do we penetrate beneath that level and see what's going on. And I think that's what is now also very much part of the agenda. Looking at beneath the C-suite, looking at what's going on within the company, the people, the managerial level, the level below that. And I think we've learned our lesson the hard way. I remember, well, it's in the public domain, a company called the bank Wells Fargo, which many people are familiar with, where for many years shareholders were looking at things going on at C-level, CEO strategy, all those really important points, but neglected to look beyond that. And that's for very understandable reasons. However, what became very apparent was that things weren't working well at Wells Fargo, and managers were being incentivized to do certain things, which led to rather poor behavior, fraud, effectively. And just sometimes looking at how incentive arrangements are permeate throughout the organization, and the incentives and the behaviors that they generate. I think it's really important to understand that. We're looking at very complex organizations, and just to look at the top level would not do justice to how those companies operate and how they're run. And I think it's incumbent upon shareholders to really delve beneath the surface.
Interesting. Thank you for that. It made me think of a circumstance I came across in an evaluation probably 10 odd years ago, where, and we're talking here about leaders, how can one person change the organization's culture? In this particular case, it was the finance director that was able to completely change the culture of the organization so that the LTIP plan paid out. So the numeric KPIs of the organization were met to the absolute cost of the company.
Yeah.
And so it aligns to what you're saying. It's not uncommon, unfortunately. And as we all know, bias gets in the way of all of us because we're human, and money is probably one of the worst that does influence our decision making. Okay, I'm going to come back to let's just cover now quickly, which I think will be an interesting one. You talked about stewardship, the importance of stewardship, and I actually was on a webinar recently where I spoke to the stewardship code and things that are important for investors. Can you talk a bit about the culture in the UK as in stewardship, in the boards as stewardship investors? Just give us all a sort of an update on this area of corporate governance.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. And for me, this is probably the most important point that we need to think about as investors and companies and advisors. I do think that stewardship has become overly complex and perhaps not looking at the right sorts of issues that it needs to. There was a recent report that many might have seen by Talk and Communications, which looked at the challenges which stewardship is facing at the moment, and the fact that investors, according to companies, aren't often fully briefed, are going into those meetings underprepared, not having the conversations that are necessary, going through a box checking exercise, and it's not really tailored for those engagements aren't really tailored for a particular company. And I do think we need to have a reset of that stewardship conversation and understand more effectively what it's about. It's for us at USS, when I was there, it certainly wasn't about ticking any boxes and saying we met with X number of companies, nor was it to say in our stewardship report that we met with X number of companies. Quantity is not important here, it's the quality of those conversations. Mm-hmm. And I do think that this is my little hobby horse at the moment, that we need to put G back in ESG. I know this will be music to your ears as well, Sharon, that G has become, as you said, the poor relation. Mm-hmm. Actually, when that acronym was first put forward, I think even the individual who I know quite well might admit that it wasn't put forward with particular thought. It was something that he came up with just to kind of for shorthand. But if one thinks about it, it doesn't actually work. Governance is very different from environmental and social issues. Environmental and social issues are the issues which boards need to address, which companies need to address. Governance is that underpin. Governance is the building blocks of engagement, of board effectiveness. So actually, we're looking at two different things here: the governance, the boards, the effectiveness of boards, and the issues which boards need to address. And I don't think that acronym, that concept works well, and it probably needs to be deconstructed and looked at again. So probably a commission, maybe the Geddes Summerfield Commission needs to be established to look at the effectiveness of stewardship in this country. But it wasn't done maliciously. This was done with all the right intentions, a stewardship code, the concept of how to, the reporting on the back of this. But I'm not sure, and maybe it'll be interesting to hear the participants' views on this, whether stewardship is fit for purpose in the way that it was intended, and whether it stands the test of time. And we perhaps need to look at this afresh.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about the acronyms that get put together and just accepted for what they are. The other one that is my hobby horse is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mm-hmm. It should be inclusion, equity gives us diversity. Because if we don't have an inclusive mindset, how can we start with equitable treatment, least of all end up with a diverse outcome? So I upset a lot of DEI people by trying to turn their acronym upside down. So I get your point 100%. So we'll pick that challenge up, and let's see if we can address some of these issues around ESG governance as a foundation to everything else. People being our risk element in the middle of all of it.
Yeah. And sorry, Sharon, just one final point to that. Many on this call will be familiar with Jim Collins' book on Built to Last and Good to Great. He focuses, and it's way before his time, I think, on this, on the importance of people, the importance of leadership, the importance of boards and that sort of thing. Not at the expense of everything else, but at the building blocks, the premise of good, effective boards. And we forget that at our peril. It's the softer stuff, which I've always believed, good old-fashioned leadership, which I believe is the key to effective boards. And for people on this call, for you, Sharon, I know this is preaching to the converted, but I think for many people, this is often forgotten.
It is often forgotten. And it's those people who, and we've seen banks, for example, you gave idea of one, but many others that are well-known names to us. You look at all the governance failures, and I don't think you could put many of it with the governance processes and procedures as to where the fault was. The faults were the humans and the way they were behaving, and their bias and influence. And a bad board, a board that is either stifling or too risk averse or is too maverick, whatever it might be, the company is the one that suffers, the stakeholders suffer. So thanks, Dan. We'll call you back again for the conversation section. John, if you'd like to join us on the panel. John, thank you for joining us. We're now going to come at the same sort of topic, but from a completely different perspective. John, having been in one organization as company secretary and all the other roles, from being a director, taking the company through listing issues out of listing environment, has seen an organization go through a high degree of change over a period of 20 years, while governance has gone through an equally dramatic demand change from our stakeholder community. So, John, you must feel nothing like the person you started there 20 odd years ago. It must feel a completely different environment to you. So just thinking back over your whole journey with Menzies Aviation, now I think you call yourselves, is it's just sort of a synopsis of different chairs, different focal journeys that you've been on. And I know we can't cover everything because, as you said, we might be here for 3 days, which is not what I think the participants are keen on. But just to try and give us an input of how different chairs have had such a different outcome on the organization.
Yeah. Wow. So where do I start? I think life was certainly much easier 20 years ago, that's for sure, and less things to think about. But we have been on a journey from, anyone old enough on this podcast remember the John Menzies shops, and now we're a complete aviation company. So we've got a lot of change. I think chairman's behaviours have had a massive impact on that. I've probably been through 4 chairmen in that time. And the character that they bring, and to be honest, and sometimes the ego that they bring, has a massive impact on how the company works. And as company secretary, I think I was quite lucky that I worked very closely with a lot of these guys, and was able to influence them by not changing their mind, but just making them aware of what we were trying to achieve at times. And I think that's very important. You can lose track of that if you have a very strong chairman. What I think for us is we had 2 very different scenarios. We had a very cautious board, probably very Scottish back in the day. And when you're trying to expand as an aviation business, with all the risk and the large investment that brings, I think the board were overcautious, and that was probably brought about by the chairman. And that can be driven, of course, by the stock market, because you don't want to be seen to be failing at something. So therefore, it's a double-edged sword, is that you have a strategy where the stock market, you tell them you're going to expand as an aviation company, but you don't want to make any investments that are too risky. And I think as a company, we struggled with that. So it was at the start about having the right investment governance in place. So, where do we want to invest and why? And then what sort of returns do we want to make? And we were very, very rigid to follow that. And I think, looking back now with my experience, we probably missed out on some opportunities. And we certainly missed out on one large opportunity where we would have had to go to the city for a fairly significant rights issue, because we were just a little bit cautious about what we are doing. And I think the chairman plays a huge role in that, because if the chairman comes in and, what I've seen is different chairmen, some chairmen will say, okay, here's the topic, can I get everybody's view? Other chairmen will say, here's my view, what do you think? And that massively changes the way the board decision-making runs.
Absolutely.
And a very clever chairman as well will choose the order of the people he goes to for their opinion. And that shaped the way our board made decisions as well. So if it was a decision that the chairman wasn't sure about, he would always go to the non-executive director who worried about debt. And they would give a negative view on life and worry about debt. And his favorite statement was, debt is permanent, profit is temporary. And that did then shape, because, if you have some non-executives then who are maybe not as confident to give their view, and you have 2 strong views, and they'll maybe say, well, okay, I tend to agree with the person before me, and you hear that. So I think it's very important that chairmans let board make their own view, and then they summarize the position. And I think that's the thing that had the biggest impact on us, because if I then move on to a subsequent chairman who was very much less risk averse, and I then had to flip into a different mode as company secretary, and then I went onto the board with this chair. I almost had to point out the risks to him, and what we were thinking about, and that drove the board. Yeah. So the way the chairman behaves and the way the chairman runs the meeting is very, very important.
Very important. And you referenced 2 chairs there. My one observation I've seen in boards that I've worked with, where if you have a predominantly finance orientated board, or a board that is primarily industry focused or regulatory focused, you've got your different kinds of themes that the board might have. But a lot of that is driven by the knowledge, professional experience, and therefore reference point by which the chair comes from. So if the chairman has come from a finance background, and everything, as you say, comes from that more risk-averse space, versus somebody who comes from a completely, come on, let's try it. We haven't tried this before. Let's go for it. Let's be very entrepreneurial. Now, our code talks about us having a creative entrepreneurial spirit on the board. Now, I know you've experienced the alternative and that, How do the individual directors respond when you have that different kind of leadership?
I think that comes down to the character of non-executives,
Yes.
and therefore your recruitment of non-executives is really, really vitally important. I think I've seen over the years we've maybe put non-executives into the seat, not to fill a seat, that would be wrong, we never did that, but who sort of tick the boxes without maybe drilling into their character. Because somebody who's strong enough to give their own opinion and give an opinion that's different from the person sitting next to them is really, really important. So that person having the right character, and I think having too many people who are financially orientated is poor. And maybe having a chairman actually who's ex-accountant or very, very financially orientated can cause problems. But again, I guess that means everyone's got to play their part. So the senior non-executive and the company secretary should then make sure that, one, they should be involved in the recruitment of non-executives, and two, they should be able to influence the chairman to say, well, okay, we could have this lady or gent, but actually that's just giving us another version of what we've already got. Let's look for the industry expert, or let's look, for Menzies, it was always very difficult because we wanted to get somebody on the board who had real airline or aviation experience, but we couldn't really take anybody who was still in an executive role that worked for an airline or an airport because they were conflicted. So we really struggled to get that professional expertise onto our board, and we did suffer a little bit from that. But yeah, making sure you have the right balance, I think, that's the cornerstone of all boards, isn't it? Is very, very important. But making sure the chairman understands that and sees that, because I think if you've got a financially orientated chairman, their comfort zone is to have lots of financially orientated people around them.
And lots of spreadsheets and none of these softer issues, not good at strategy, just looking at the numbers. And as we know, if we look at a business from its numbers perspective only, things don't always work out.
Yeah, well, I was in charge of risk for a long time at Menzies. It started off as sort of corporate risk, and I got involved in a little bit of operational risk. And my favourite statement was always, look, if the numbers add up, we think we should do it. But that's, the numbers always add up, but it would never come to the board. So it's about the risk. It's simple risks about who's going to run it. How quickly can we put our systems in place? What is the competition in that area? What are the dynamics in that country or that airport? So the finances adding up is one very, very important pillar. But the board must look at the other pillars as well, and that's people and its risk. And if you don't identify your risks, I could tell you 10 things we did where we didn't make the returns, and it wasn't because the financial model was wrong. It was because something else that we didn't think of happened.
Exactly. And invariably those are people related. And it comes back to my, we were talking a moment ago about governance appearing to be the sort of poor cousin sitting at the end of ES&G.
Yeah.
The committee that has failed so badly over the decade is improving now is the nominations committee, because so many chairmen don't see the importance of that. We just appoint the right person. Nominations committees have not been very well empowered, inappropriately often chaired by the chairman of the board, which then means it's going to be ineffective anyway. So back to your people issue is coming around to that nomination and the chairing of the nomination side. How's Menzies adapted to that over the years?
Yeah, I mean, if I go back over the years, in the earlier years, one of the problems I had was the chairman would always say to me, "Oh, John, why do I have to have a nominations committee? Well, we're fine. We've got a board. We've got." I said, "Well, you have to look at everything. You have to look at succession planning. You have to look at all these things." I used to sort of drag them screaming and kicking to a nomination committee every year. I think we got a bit better at that, and certainly we had a few issues with succession planning, and we operated for a number of years without a chief executive. with two very strong managing directors of our two operating divisions. And that worked very well when we had a strong and very good CFO in the middle, who was, probably doing a bit of a chief exec's job in reality. But when he retired, all hell let loose, really. So, and that's where I think the nomination committee became more important. The non-execs got more involved, and look, we need to do this, we do it properly. And really, you then do look really deeply into succession planning. So through probably getting our fingers burnt, our nomination committee became quite important, and looked at it, and actually then started to look, down at the C-suite as well, and what talent we had coming through there, and also picked up the diversity angle as well.
I think one of the big issues that people have, it's one of the key biases that impacts decision making is, well, if that's what we've got available, should just go with it rather than going down the road of looking at the alternatives, whether that be an investment decision, a use of cash, a debt offering, or people. Yeah. And so often we've seen it in our Prime Minister's last person standing, has happened a couple of times. And how have your chairs led in that space or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I became increasingly frustrated about, so for about 15 years, I also led our investor relations program, working very close, obviously, with chief exec and finance directors and in the city a lot. And I became increasingly frustrated that the city is driving the wrong behaviours in boardrooms. And we were then driven to make decisions because you're on this 6-month hamster wheel for city results, and chairman and chief exec's reputations are on the line at that point, and it drives short-term decision making. I don't care what anybody says, and a lot of the stewardship and the shareholder activism has a very much a one-size-fits-all approach. And it doesn't, one size doesn't fit all.
It doesn't.
Why would Menzies as an aviation company be the same as a petrochemical company or whatever? They're all different, with different stages of maturity as well. And I think that's very important. So that was our biggest issue. I think you become a slave to the share price, especially if you've gone through a transformation like we had, and then there's a drive to make the aviation business succeed. But then within that, you have a subset of shareholders, say 10 or 15 major shareholders, but 3 or 4 of them can have a very different view. So we had quite a few US investors who weren't worried about debt. We had UK fund managers who were obsessed about debt, and then European fund managers who sometimes had a different view. So how do you manage your investment strategy when you have major investors with such divergent views? And that became a big challenge for the chairman and the board. And I think you then become nervous about a decision that actually might be in the long term the best thing for the business, but in the short term may give you some share price issues. And that, I think that today is probably the biggest issue that PLC boards have.
Very, very challenging. Dan, would you like to join us? So we've just sort of a question to both of you, and then I'm going to pick up questions from the floor. Looking at the corporate cultures that you've all worked in, and I mean, John, you've been in one company, many corporate cultures. Dan, you've invested in many companies, many corporate cultures. To what extent do you think you can attribute that change in culture to the chairman of the board at that point in time? So Dan, maybe you give John's voice a quick break. From your perspective, how correlated is that?
Yeah, well, I think it partly depends on how diverse the board is when selecting a chair. And I must say, I came across many boards of companies, so many different chairs of companies based in different jurisdictions, and very often you had a chair which was very much steeped in the culture of that particular country. So, for example, I did quite a bit of engagement with some Dutch companies, and it was very much and it's nothing about Dutch culture, but they are, there's a very much of a protectionist type style about the way that boards and companies operate in the Netherlands. And in this particular case, this company was subject to a takeover bid by an American company. And one did detect very quickly the sort of the Dutch market tendencies creeping into those discussions, even though this company was a multinational company operating in many different jurisdictions. But there are other companies which are truly diverse, where the chair was from a very different sector, very different background. And I think there we had very rich conversations, because it was very much from an objective perspective that was given in those discussions. So again, Sharon, I think it depends really on how progressive a company is, how progressive a board is, how much thought has gone into the selection and nomination of board directors, and ultimately the chairperson.
Yeah. John, in your case, you've had quite a few chairs that are directors, but they're chairs in other organizations as well. So maybe broaden your answer to include their behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can have a huge impact. We had, I see a difference a chair can make by, one was very, very inclusive. So he came in and he banned ties from the boardroom. I think sometimes in a head office, our head office was very used to the board appearing every second month on a Friday. They'd walk into the boardroom, they'd shuffle out from the boardroom, and you'd never really see them. And this particular chair made a point of wandering about the office and chatting to people and introducing himself to people. When he traveled internationally, which he did a lot in his other directorships, he insisted that any airport where Menzies had an operation, he had a tour of that airport. And actually what he did was he sat in crew rooms and chatted to people and probably got the real temperature of the company rather than what is actually told to him through board reports. And I think that had a massive impact on the company. It made the board seem more human to the employees. And actually what you saw then happening was other non-execs copied that. But even some of the senior managers as well were thinking, oh, but I better go in the crew room as well and chat to everybody. And it drove a different culture, and it was a much more positive, inclusive culture. Where other times, I think if the board can be a little bit too austere and just read board reports and come in and out of company. So, and I think with other chairmen, I think there are other directorships sometimes had an impact on how they viewed ourselves. I had a chairman who was who I liked and was very strong, but because some of his other directorships were of companies much bigger than ours, he saw us as a little bit of a, well, you're quite small, really, and at the time we were probably about a £400 million market cap business, so we weren't really that small, and that was frustrating as an executive, because we weren't a FTSE top 10. It didn't mean to be that we were sort of Mickey Mouse PLC. So I think the chairman must always put into perspective the different companies they have, and that can drive their behavior as well. And I know some of us found that frustrating at the time. I hope he's not on this call because he'll understand who he is. But yeah, so I think their external directorships can influence how they behave in the company, and it did for us for sure. Certainly when they're directors of bigger companies and they're coming down to a smaller company that's in growth mode, you need to have a slightly different mindset. I think governance is hugely important at that time, especially if you're growing very quickly. But the behavior of the chairman can really set the culture of the business.
It can, absolutely. Dan, can you just give us the author and the title of that book you referred to earlier?
Yeah, these are books by Jim Collins, and one book is called Good to Great, and the other one is Built to Last.
That's it. I remember now. Thank you very much for that. just talking about board development, educating the board. To what extent, in your experience, knowing what we all know now in terms of how boards are being expected to behave, not misbehave, which is so often the case, is there a space for, the question that's come from one of our people on the floor is there the opportunity for learning development, boardroom training, courses, education? How do you think we can change it? Because getting rid of the whole board is not an answer. Getting rid of some might be the answer. Refreshing the board over the next 3 years is definitely an answer. But is there something we can do in between that doesn't put the board's behavior into shock and awe, and therefore ineffectiveness in a different way? Dan, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm all for progressive ways of populating a board. And when I was on the other side, you know, I saw some very, very good examples of where companies would come to their largest investors and introduce potential non-execs to some of their shareholders. And this was a really useful way of shareholders being part of that nomination process. So obviously the company had done it, the board had done its due diligence, had gone through a selection process, but this was their preferred candidate. But it was the option and the opportunity for both us to meet a non-exec before we put our pen to paper, so to speak, and formally ratify that person when we get at the next annual general meeting. But there's also an opportunity for the non-exec to understand shareholders' views and concerns prior to formally taking up the appointment. But it was a really informative discussion. I think where we sit, you know, where companies did it well, they did it really well. More often than not, you know, when we're looking at the appointment of directors, all we received was very, very scant information. It was very seldom did you receive a biography of the person, a personal statement from the individual. It was, you know, this person served on this company's boards from X to Y, X date to Y date. Doesn't really say very much about that person. And I think
how they're going to fit in.
Yes, and what's driving them, why they're interested in the role. No, it sounds rather basic stuff, but actually, funny enough, some of the Japanese boards in their annual reports used to provide, I don't know if it's still the case, but really detailed information on the individual. You know, it was a half a page on each person who's being put forward for appointment. And explained also, you know, there's a personal statement as well from the individual, why they felt they were appropriate for that board and what they were going to bring to the board. Again, a lot of it was a bit of gloss, but it's the principle, I think, which was important.
Mm-hmm. And John, your area on education, learning, upskilling.
I think that's important, but I think you have to look at the skills that person brings, and for me, it's about an effective nomination committee, and you have to look and say, right, I have 5 board seats for our argument's sake, and what do I want from each of those seats? You know, so you will have an accountant who may chair the audit committee. You may have, you know, somebody with city experience. You want somebody who understands remuneration, because I think that's something that can be very painful when you have somebody who doesn't. You may have you know, the widget expert. If I was saying we're in aviation, we couldn't find that, but you know, I think it's important the board have somebody who understands your industry. Mm-hmm. So what do you want from every seat? Don't just put a non-executive in who's got great experience, having been MD of 10 companies. You should identify what you want from each seat and how they will add value to your board. I think if you do that, you have a much better understanding. Because you can't keep adding to people. So if you have 4 or 5 seats, how do you get the most out of each seat?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And in your opinion, as a company secretary, and you look at the ineffectiveness of the board, whether it be ineffectiveness of a chair or ineffectiveness of a chair of a committee, what do you think is the best thing a board can do when when that elephant is in the room?
I think you have to address it, and you have to address it quickly. I've seen people sit in our board for a few years and be very ineffectual. You know, I could tell they hadn't read the board papers or only read some of them. You know, or one or two others who had, you know, definitely read all the board papers, but almost they hadn't understood yet that they're actually a non-executive now and still not in an executive role. And board meetings went on for hours while they told the executive exactly how you should run the company. So I think you can't let that fester. That the chairman has to then address that and speak to them and either ask them to amend their style. And you know, a bit like in any life, you know, if I'm not doing a good job as a company secretary, I should move on. So you can't let that person fester in a seat being either unproductive or disruptive.
Thank you. Closing single sentence from each of you, because we are up on time now. Our title is, Can One Person Change the Effectiveness of a Board? Dan?
Sorry, it was me. I think I have to say it depends. I can't say. I'm afraid I'm not. I can't. I don't think it falls down to that one. But I think it can if you've got the right person. But yeah, I think it really depends.
Okay, John.
Excuse me.
Yes, they can. And if they're doing so with the best intentions and good knowledge base, then they absolutely can influence a board for the better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we've all got to ensure that the future chairs of all our businesses understand the importance of their learning and their growth, so that they can be the best chairman of our boards, because they are such key influences on the sustainability of organizations, the ethos, the moral compass. All those things are so critical. So I'd like to thank you both. This has been fascinating, and having the two very different perspectives for me has been extremely valuable. Thank you to the floor for your questions. I didn't manage to get to exactly all of them, but I think some of them we covered during the initial stage as well. So thank you very much for the engagement. It's hugely appreciated. And to my panel, I couldn't do it without you. I really do appreciate it. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, John. I appreciate both of it, and we'll be in touch.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much to everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.